Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're asking why a food allergy claim at a shared meal can suddenly sound like a social challenge instead of a simple safety note.
Yeah, because the weird part is how fast people treat it like they're being judged. A food allergy is an immune system reaction, not just being picky. But in the moment, people still act like they need to cross-examine you.
Right, and that's the starting take. The reaction often says more about the room than the meal. So let's start with why people hear a restriction and immediately start demanding proof. Sam, start us off.
Okay, before we make this a medical lecture, let's talk about the part people actually feel in the room. Somebody says, "I can't eat that," and half the table suddenly acts like they've been accused of a crime. Not a real crime, obviously, but the mood changes fast. It stops being dinner and turns into everybody checking their own hands like, wait, did I do something wrong?
That's the useful starting point. The first reaction usually isn't, tell me more about your immune system. It's more like, oh, great, now my food is under review. And if you're hosting, even a simple restriction can feel like a comment on your competence, your care, or whether you remembered the one thing you were supposed to remember.
So am I overstating it if I say the allergy statement lands less like information and more like a social accusation? Not a formal accusation, but a vibe. It's not just this person has a rule. It's this person's rule is now making me look at what I served, what I bought, whether I asked enough questions, and whether I'm about to look like an idiot in front of everybody.
No, that's pretty close. Shared meals are weirdly intimate, so a restriction can feel personal, even when it isn't meant personally. Food is one of those things where effort, care, and identity get tangled together. So when somebody changes the rules at the table, people hear it as a judgment faster than they should. It doesn't mean the feeling is noble. It just means it shows up instantly.
And then everyone gets very serious about the menu, like they're running a small tribunal over mashed potatoes. Which is funny, because the actual request is usually boring in the best possible way. Please don't give me that thing. But socially it becomes, now we all need to know the backstory, the proof, and whether this is going to turn into a whole evening.
That's where the friction lives. People want to know whether they need to change the menu, change the serving utensils, or just relax and keep eating. And because they want a practical answer, they often start asking for certainty in a way that sounds like doubt. Are you really allergic, or is this just a preference? That question can be useful, but it can also land like a test nobody agreed to take.
Which, to be fair, is the socially rude version of a real question. If you're feeding people, you do need to know what's an actual limit and what's just someone being picky. But the moment you ask it badly, it sounds like, prove you deserve accommodation before I believe you. And people get touchy fast. That's not because everybody is fragile. It's because the wording makes the request feel like a challenge.
Yeah, because the proof request has two meanings, and people hear the ugly one first. One meaning is, help me avoid making a mistake. The other is, I don't believe you, and I want to make you earn basic consideration. Same words, very different social temperature. And in a shared meal, temperature matters a lot, because nobody wants to spend dinner on the defensive.
And that's why the whole thing gets weirdly defensive so fast. Nobody wants to feel like they have to present a little passport before dinner. They just want not to get sick, not to get judged, and not to spend 20 minutes defending the existence of a thing that already exists. Even if the host means well, the whole exchange can still feel like, why are we litigating my lunch?
That's the tension. The host wants a clean rule for what they're supposed to do next, but the guest doesn't want their body turned into a debate topic. So this becomes a social negotiation before it's anything else. What counts as enough explanation? How much caution is reasonable? Who has to adapt? And how much personal offense each side is quietly bringing to the table. The actual meal is often the smallest thing happening, which is kind of embarrassing for everyone involved.
And the weird part is that the request itself is often tiny. It's not rebuild your whole house. It's don't hand me the thing I said will mess me up. But because people hear that as a statement about their hosting, their honesty, or their competence, they start reacting to the implication instead of the logistics. That's where a practical problem turns into a dignity problem.
That's the cleaner version. The request is small. The emotional interpretation is huge. And the emotional part is not imaginary, because people really do care about being seen as thoughtful or trustworthy. But once that kicks in, the conversation stops being, what do we serve? And starts being, who gets believed? That's the line that makes everybody tense, even when nobody says it out loud.
So the real question is why people keep turning a coordination problem into a little dignity contest. Because once it becomes about who gets believed, now nobody's just serving dinner anymore. They're managing status. And everybody can feel that shift, even if they can't say it cleanly.
And that's where the next layer is. Suspicion isn't always crazy, but the social punishment for asking clumsily is also real. So we should probably pressure test where the suspicion is fair and where it just turns a normal question into a needless challenge.
Okay, but before we get to the boring definition question, here's why this gets touchy in the room. The second somebody says they have a food allergy, people stop hearing a simple request and start hearing a social judgment. Not always because the guest meant one, more because everybody suddenly feels like the meal is being evaluated, and that makes people weird fast.
That's the real pressure point. A shared meal is supposed to be easy, generous, almost automatic. And then the allergy request adds work and uncertainty at the exact moment people were expecting to relax. The host starts wondering about ingredients, substitutions, cross-contact, and whether they missed something obvious. That stress can show up as suspicion, even when it is really just embarrassment.
Right, and nobody likes feeling like the dinner is turning into a competence exam. Even if the guest is being perfectly polite, the host can still hear, "I hope you didn't mess this up," and that is a nasty little feeling. It is not fair, but it is common because people hate being put in a position where they have to prove they were careful enough.
And that's where the defensiveness kicks in. Not because the person asking necessarily accused anybody, but because the host heard pressure before they heard the actual request.
So what part of that reaction is actually fair, Joe? Because some of it is just, I am being asked to think harder, and some of it is, I feel blamed for not already knowing. Those are not the same thing.
I think the fair part is the added labor. People are allowed to notice that a request changes the shape of the meal. What becomes unfair is when they turn that into a story about the guest being dramatic, dishonest, or difficult. A lot of the friction is just that meals are social, and social settings make every inconvenience feel a little more personal than it is.
And the personal part is what makes people act stupid. If somebody is quiet, they look suspicious. If they ask for details, they look hostile. If they joke about it, they look dismissive. So everyone ends up performing politeness while also trying not to feel managed. And that is where the whole thing gets ugly. Awkwardness starts looking like deception because nobody has a better explanation ready.
Yeah, and the uncertainty matters. Sometimes the request is simple. Sometimes it forces the host to think through the entire menu and decide what is safe, what is not, and how much effort they can reasonably handle. that is not the same as resenting the person. It's more like, oh, this changed from serving food to checking the food. Where would you draw the line between a normal adjustment and a request that turns into an all-night project?
That's the line people keep trying to find without saying it out loud. They're often not asking, is this medically real? They are asking, am I about to be trapped in a complicated explanation, or worse, made to feel like a bad person if I ask one more question? And because they do not want to sound rude, they hide that fear inside proof questions.
Which is why the better suspicion is narrower than the ugly one. The reasonable version is not, this person is lying. It's, this interaction makes everybody self-conscious, and self-conscious people get prickly. That still does not justify treating the request like an accusation. It just explains why the room gets tense so fast. And once the room is tense, every follow-up sounds loaded.
Exactly. So the next boring but useful question is the one everybody skips. What actually counts as an allergy, and what just sounds like one because people lump preferences, restrictions, and real medical stuff together in the same awkward conversation? Okay, but before we keep arguing about restaurant etiquette, we should probably stop using food issue like it means one thing. People act like every restriction is the same species of problem, and it's not. That's half the reason these conversations turn into nonsense.
That's the useful cleanup. At the practical level, an allergy is the immune system version. The body treats the food like a threat, and that can get serious. It's not just, I'd rather not. It's a different mechanism, a different risk, and usually a different level of caution from everybody else at the table.
So if I'm hearing you right, this is the one where the body is actually involved, not just the mood. That's the line people blur all the time because they hear, I can't eat this, and mentally file it under one giant food annoyance drawer.
Exactly. Then you get intolerance, which is a different thing. That's usually a digestive problem, not the immune system. It can still ruin your day, and it can still be very real, but it's not the same kind of danger as an allergy. The FDA and Mayo Clinic both make that basic split pretty plainly, which is why the sloppy language matters so much.
And then there's plain preference, which is just, I hate mushrooms. Don't ambush me with fungi. That's not a medical claim. That's a taste opinion with a little attitude on it.
Right. And there are broader restrictions too that aren't about an immune reaction at all. Religious rules, ethical rules, or just a personal line about what somebody will eat. Those can be completely sincere without being medical. The problem starts when everybody uses the same word for all of it and expects the room to read their mind.
But Joe, is the issue the label itself or the way people use it as a shield? Because those are different complaints. One says the word is bad. The other says people are sloppy with it.
It's mostly the second one. The label is useful when it tells the truth clearly. The trouble is when somebody reaches for the strongest word because they want the meal handled fast, or because they don't want to explain themselves in public. And then the other person hears a medical claim that may be doing more work than it should.
So the suspicion isn't always, this person is lying. Sometimes it's just, I think you're using a bigger word than you need. Which, annoyingly, is enough to make everybody tense up.
Yeah, because allergy sounds like a safety category, not just a preference category. That's why people react hard to it. They hear something that changes the stakes for the kitchen, the host, and the whole table. If somebody says, I don't do dairy, that lands differently from, I have a dairy allergy, even before you get into whether either person is being dramatic.
And once the word starts carrying that much weight, everybody gets weirdly legalistic about it. People want sympathy, but they also want specificity. They don't want to be interrogated, but they also don't want to be asked to rearrange the whole meal on the basis of a vibe.
That's the tension. A reasonable question is, what happens if you eat it? A bad one is acting like the person needs to prove their digestive life story before anyone will pass the salad. There's a middle ground between blind trust and cross-examination, and people miss it because they either over-accommodate or over-suspicion the moment they hear the word.
So the clean version is, allergy means the immune system potentially serious bucket. Intolerance means a different bodily problem. Preference means taste, and restriction means a rule or line that's not medical. Once you separate those, the social reaction gets less stupid. You can still be annoyed, but at least you're annoyed at the right thing.
Exactly. And once the categories are clear, the next argument is the more awkward one. Why do people still hear the word as a personal accusation? And why does vague wording make everybody more suspicious than they need to be?
Okay, before we turn this into a morality play, I think the useful split is simple. What do you actually need to know for safety? And what are you asking because you want to size the person up? Because those are not the same question, even if people act like they are.
That's the right frame. The dumb version is people are faking. But the opposite dumb version is never ask anything, which is also not how shared meals, or honestly any real-world accommodation, works. If somebody says they can't eat something, the first job is not to become a detective. It's to figure out what has to change.
Yeah, because if somebody says they can't eat nuts, shellfish, sesame, whatever the trigger is, the task is pretty small. You need to know what to avoid, whether there is a cross-contact problem, and whether the kitchen can actually make the swap. You do not need their whole personal history like you're filling out a dating profile for the allergy.
And that's basically how accommodation is supposed to work in ordinary systems too. A reasonable accommodation is just a change in the way things are usually done so somebody can participate. And sometimes the only legit follow-up is a narrow one. What limitation are we planning around, and what adjustment solves it? That is very different from asking for a personality audit.
Exactly. What do you need is fine. Prove it to me. Preferably with a tragic backstory and a notarized explanation of your childhood is not a safety question.
Yeah,
it's just nosiness
that's
with
just
better
nosiness
posture.
in a clean shirt.
So what part of that is actually fair, Joe? Is the issue the request itself or the way people use the request to pry? Because I do think people hear the word allergy and immediately picture somebody trying to win an argument instead of somebody trying to get through dinner without a problem.
The request itself is usually fine. The extra digging is the problem, especially when the only thing at stake is whether there's a real risk of cross-contact or just a simple swap. If the answer is, we can leave off the sauce, or we need a separate utensil, then that is the conversation. You do not need a court proceeding because someone asked for the shrimp to stay off the plate.
That's the thing people hate. The answer is rarely yes or no. It's more like, here's the risk, here's what we can do, and no, you don't get courtroom level proof before we adjust the menu. And I think that's where the lazy skeptic overreaches, because they want certainty from a situation that only gives probabilities in a dinner reservation.
Right, and the honest middle is not believe everything and not interrogate everybody. It's ask the minimum needed to do the job, then stop making the person's private medical stuff the main event. That is true in food service, and it's true anywhere else a person is asking for a practical adjustment instead of a referendum on their honesty.
And that makes the dumb public take look even dumber. People hear, I can't eat that, and act like they were handed an attack on the whole buffet, when the useful response is usually just, got it, what do we need to change? The weird part is how fast a tiny logistics question turns into this whole emotional performance about belief. Like anybody asked for a TED Talk.
Exactly. The polite script is no problem, but the real question underneath it is small and practical. What do we need to know so nobody gets hurt and nobody has to audition for the role of believable diner? That is the cleaner standard, and it is a lot less theatrical than the way people talk about it.
Okay, so the polite version is always, I'm just trying to be careful. But the real question is what that sentence is doing socially. It is not only about the food, it's also a way of saying, please don't make this awkward for me, while pretending the awkwardness is just about ingredients.
That is the cleaner way to say it. The polite explanation sounds generous, and sometimes it is. But it also gives everyone a usable story that doesn't involve admitting the messier part. Shared meals are work, and people resent work when they did not choose it. Nobody wants to say that out loud because it sounds petty, so they dress it up as concern.
And of course, the minute you say the honest version, you sound like a monster. Sorry, your restriction is inconvenient is not a great dinner party opener. But that doesn't mean the feeling isn't there. It just means people are better at being socially acceptable than being honest about irritation.
Mostly, yes. And I think that gap matters. Because the gap is where all the weirdness lives. The person asking about the allergy may genuinely be trying to avoid harm, but they may also be bracing for extra effort, extra rules, extra explanation, and the possibility that they will be judged for not already knowing everything. Those can all be true at once.
So here's the ugly social read. The question can become a little test. Are you easy? Are you dramatic? Are you going to make us reorganize the whole meal around you? That's not always the conscious thought, but it is absolutely the vibe in a lot of rooms. People love neutrality until neutrality asks them to change a napkin plan.
Am I overstating that if I say it's a test? Or is it more accurate to say people are just trying to find out how much work they're about to inherit? Because those are close, but not the same.
No, that's fair. I don't mean everybody is running a secret audition. I mean, the conversation can behave like one. The moment somebody has a restriction, other people start measuring how much adaptation it will cost them, and then they start reacting to the cost as if it were the person's personality.
That's the useful distinction, though. The social penalty is often not the restriction itself. It's the burden and the interpretation. Once somebody has to adapt, people start reading the request as a personality claim, which is unfair, but also very human. A lot of host anxiety is really, please have a need, just don't make me feel small while meeting it.
Right, because the request gets translated into character. If you say you can't eat something, a weird number of people hear, I am about to become the main character of this dinner. And then they get defensive before they've even decided to be helpful. It's like the request itself is being treated as a bid for status, when most of the time it's just a dinner with extra rules.
Not every time, but enough that people get twitchy. They hear a possible accusation hiding inside the request, that they were careless, cheap, uninformed, or bad at hosting. That's why the conversation can get weirdly moralized so fast. A practical question becomes a referendum on character if nobody handles it cleanly.
And then the person with the restriction gets handed the emotional cleanup. They have to sound calm, grateful, not needy, not preachy, not dramatic, and somehow prove they are not inventing the whole thing for attention. So now, the person with the need is doing customer service for everybody else's feelings, which is a pretty gross little deal if you stop and look at it.
That part is real without turning into a conspiracy theory about every question. The better, honest answer is not everyone is secretly hostile. It's people dislike carrying invisible costs, so they hide that dislike behind politeness. That is less dramatic, but it's truer. And it explains why the conversation feels so loaded, even when nobody says anything openly rude.
Yeah, politeness often means the restricted person does the extra work. They do the explaining, the calming, the reassurance, the proof, the social smoothing, and sometimes the apologizing for having the nerve to need accommodation at all. So the polite answer is, we just want to be careful. And the real answer is usually closer to burden management and trust.
And once you see that, the next question is the one people avoid. How much of that suspicion is actually earned, and how much of it is just baked into the way we talk about food, inconvenience, and who gets treated like a nuisance the second the menu stops being simple? Okay, but before we keep treating this like a manners debate, let's separate the actual risk from the social weirdness. Food allergies are not just a picky eating thing with a dramatic label on it. The CDC treats them as a real food safety and public health concern, including in schools where prevention and emergency response have to be planned for.
Not the same as, I just don't like almond flour, in other words.
Exactly. And that's why the conversation gets touchy so fast, because the stakes are uneven. Some food issues are annoying, some are personal, and some can become anaphylaxis level serious. The CDC guidance is pretty plain that this is not a category where people should just wing it and hope the room's being reasonable.
Which is why everybody turns into a little buffet line investigator the second somebody says allergy. Like suddenly the room is full of amateur detectives trying to determine whether the person is in danger or just being a pain about the pasta salad.
And some of that reaction is stupid. But not all of it comes from nowhere. Allergies, sensitivities, preferences, and plain old pickiness all sit next to each other socially. So people learn the wrong habit. They hear one restriction and start sorting it like they're trying to spot a scam. The problem is that the same sentence can mean, please leave the peanuts off my plate, or if this gets mixed in, we have an actual emergency.
So where do you draw the line then? What's the fair version of asking for proof, and what's just people being nosy because they don't want to change the menu or feel judged for serving whatever they already made?
I think the fair version is practical, not skeptical in the movie villain sense. If you're hosting, you want to know whether you need to keep the peanuts out of the room, use a separate spoon, or just not hand that person the dish with the obvious trigger in it. That's a real difference. A shared meal is not a courtroom, but it is also not a place where everyone automatically has the same risk.
Right, because once you've got a birthday cake, a serving knife, and one person saying, I can't eat with that touched, the question is not whether they're morally impressive. It's whether the cake needs a new knife or the whole thing needs to stop being casual for 10 seconds.
That's the useful, concrete version. And the medical side does matter here. The FDA says people with a known food allergy who have symptoms after eating should seek medical attention, and they should talk through reactions with a healthcare provider. So the facts do not support the lazy response of, oh, you're probably fine. They do support taking the claim seriously enough to adjust the meal and not improvise like a hero.
And then the etiquette part gets messy because even the warning labels become social objects. The FDA notes that allergen advisory statements are something allergic people should avoid, which tells you that one tiny label can change whether somebody eats the food at all. That's not a moral lecture. It's just a reminder that caution has actual behavior attached to it.
Right. And now everybody at the table starts treating caution itself like an accusation. Are you saying my food is unsafe? Maybe not. Maybe the person eating just has to make a decision with incomplete information. And everybody else hates being the one whose normal dinner got slowed down by a real-world constraint they didn't choose.
That's the part people react to, honestly. Not just the request, but the feeling that the request makes them look careless or overblown or somehow socially incorrect for not anticipating every possible problem in the room.
Yeah, and that's why the suspicious version of the conversation keeps coming back. The allergy might be real, the accommodation might be reasonable, and the person asking still gets treated like they're bringing bad vibes to dinner. So the next question is, who benefits from keeping that little courtroom energy alive instead of just making the meal safer and moving on?
I think the next question is, who actually gets rewarded when somebody says, hey, I have a food allergy, and the room immediately acts like that request is some kind of accusation? Because the weird part is not just the doubt. It is how often doubt makes the other person do extra labor just to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and most of that reward is boring, not cinematic. If you doubt the claim, you get to avoid effort, avoid awkward menu changes, and avoid feeling responsible for getting it wrong. That is a pretty powerful little incentive, even when nobody is sitting there plotting it out.
That is the whole scammy little magic trick of it. Not an actual scam, to be clear. Just a social move where prove it becomes a way to hand the burden back to the person with the restriction. You do not have to change much if you can make them explain more.
Right, and that burden is not nothing. Once someone has to explain their allergy, they are also deciding how much private detailed handover, how formal to sound, how apologetic to be, and whether they want to become the person who is making dinner weird. The social cost is real before you even get to the food.
And that is why it shows up everywhere. At a house dinner, at a work lunch, at somebody's office potluck, the same thing happens. The person with the restriction has to make the request legible, while everyone else gets to keep acting normal. The default is convenience for the room, not clarity for the person asking.
Exactly. Even institutions basically train people to think that way. They tend to look for the least burdensome path, which is not always malicious. Sometimes that is just how you keep a system functioning. But it means the person asking for a change often has to make the case very legibly before anything moves. The request has to become simple for everyone else.
So in a shared meal, can you prove it can really mean, can you turn your problem into something I can handle without thinking too hard? That is not usually how people say it out loud, obviously, but that is the shape of it. The proof demand is often just a cleaner looking version of, make this easy for me.
And you see the same logic in work settings all the time. Somebody asks for clarity, then the whole thing turns into a mini bureaucracy. Who said what? What exactly is needed? How official is this? Can we get it in writing? Sometimes that is a sensible way to avoid mistakes, but it also pushes the energy cost onto the person who already has the constraint.
Which is the part that bugs me. The person with the restriction is now managing other people's comfort too. The host's uncertainty, the coworker's skepticism, the little fear that somebody might be doing too much or asking for special treatment. So the person with the need becomes the one doing customer service for the room.
That is a good way to say it. And it also explains the over-explaining. People do not just want the food handled correctly. They want to be believed. Because being believed is what turns the request from annoying into real. If you can get the other person to accept the premise, you do not have to spend 5 minutes defending your own existence at the table.
Am I overstating it if I say some people also like skepticism because it makes them look practical? Like they get to perform the role of the discerning adult in the room, the one who is not falling for nonsense.
No, that part is real. There is a whole personality niche built around sounding reasonable while quietly making the other person do the proving. It is not always conscious, which is almost more annoying, because then it feels like just being careful instead of a choice with a cost. And once that label is on them, they can feel virtuous while everybody else does the extra work.
And that is the unfair part. The careful person keeps their clean self-image, while the person with the restriction pays in disclosure, patience, and extra politeness. Even when nobody is trying to be cruel, the cost still lands in the same place. That's what makes it so sticky. Nobody feels like the bad guy, but one person still leaves the interaction more tired.
So the incentive map is simple enough. Doubt lets one side save effort, and explanation forces the other side to spend it. That does not prove malice. It just explains why the same little dinner argument keeps rebooting itself. The fair question is where skepticism is reasonable and where it is just a socially acceptable way to dodge responsibility.
Yeah, and that is the pressure test next. We should make the strongest fair version of the skeptical side, because some of this really is about mistakes, liability, and not wanting to be careless. But we also need the strongest fair version of the person asking for the restriction, because I need you to take this seriously is not a luxury request. Okay, but the fair version of this argument is the next question, right? Because there is a real annoyance when somebody drops a restriction into a shared meal. And there is also a real safety issue. Those are not the same thing, even if people keep mashing them together.
That's the split. One person is thinking, I need enough information to cook for a group without guessing. And the other is thinking, I'm trying to tell you what keeps me safe. If you flatten those into one category, everybody gets stupid.
And the skeptical side is not imaginary. If you've ever hosted, you know the pain of the late breaking, oh, actually, I can't eat that, when the meal is already built around one plan. People start wondering whether this is a serious restriction or just somebody treating the table like a custom buffet for their personal taste. And that suspicion comes from somewhere real.
And to be fair, that suspicion doesn't come from nowhere. But the moment it becomes prove it to me in a scolding voice, you've stopped asking for coordination and started demanding a little courtroom drama.
Yeah, that's the part I'd keep. Asking for clarity is normal. Acting like every claim is a scam is lazy. There's a difference between help me not screw this up and I don't believe you until you defend your body to my satisfaction.
And the strongest version of the other side is that people are not usually trying to make your dinner harder for sport. A lot of the time, they are trying to avoid being ignored, joked about, or quietly served the wrong thing because somebody decided politeness was more important than listening.
So the fair objection is really about burden and honesty, not about denying that people can have real restrictions. You want to know whether this is a tiny preference, a serious medical issue, or a social ask that changes what you need to do. Is that basically the honest version of the complaint, or is it still too generous?
Pretty much, yes. The question itself is not evil. The problem is when somebody acts like uncertainty is evidence of bad character, because then a practical request turns into a status move. If I don't fully understand you, I get to treat you like you're faking.
That's the piece people skip. They think they are being rational, but sometimes they're just making the other person pay a social tax for being inconvenient. And look, I get why hosts get jumpy. If one person's restriction changes the menu, the cook wants enough information to adjust without playing detective.
Right. And that's the legitimate concern. Not, I need your medical file by noon. Just, tell me enough so I don't accidentally make this a disaster. The reasonable version is about coordination, not ownership.
And the unfair version is when people act like the only honest guest is the one who gives a neat, satisfying explanation on command. Some boundaries are simple. Some people don't want to turn a dinner invite into an intake form. That's not mysterious. It's just a person saying, I'm here to eat, not testify.
Which is why curiosity has to stay attached to the actual job. If your question helps you set the table, that is one thing. If your question mainly lets you act offended that somebody has needs, then you're no longer being careful. You're being nosy with better posture.
That's a good line. And maybe that's the real pressure test. Ask for enough detail to avoid being reckless, not so much that you turn ordinary caution into a loyalty test. Because once the question stops being, how do we feed you safely, and becomes, convince me you're allowed to ask, you've already gone too far.
Exactly. Curiosity is fair when it helps you accommodate. It gets rude when the main thing it does is force somebody to justify their appetite, their body, or their boundaries to your satisfaction. And that's the line we should keep drawing. Harder, not softer.
Okay, so the line is not never ask anything. The line is whether you're asking to keep dinner safe or asking because you want the person to justify themselves in front of everybody.
That's the clean version. If you need to know about ingredients, cross contact, the pan, the spoon, all that boring stuff, fair. If you're asking how real it is so you can decide whether to believe them, now you're doing social enforcement, not dinner planning.
And people mash those together on purpose. Somebody says, I have a food allergy, and half the room hears, please start a debate about whether I deserve to be here.
A lot of it is that people hate feeling corrected. Nobody loves being told, even indirectly, that the normal meal setup is not automatically safe. But that feeling does not entitle you to drag somebody through a credibility exam just because you are annoyed.
So what does a fair follow-up actually sound like? Because there is a version that is just responsible, and then there is the version where somebody gets weirdly interested in the person's medical history over hummus.
The fair version is short and practical. Can you eat anything here? What ingredients matter? Do we need a separate serving spoon? Should we keep this dish off the table? It is about action, not origin story. And if they invited more detail, then fine, you can talk more.
Right. And if the answer is no, the next move is not prove it. The next move is, okay, what works? That is the whole difference between being helpful and being annoying with a clean shirt on.
Mostly, yes. If somebody tells you they cannot eat something, you do not need to turn into a junior prosecutor. You ask once, you listen, and you stop trying to win an invisible argument. A decent host wants to solve the dinner problem, not establish a verdict.
Because a lot of people are not actually chasing truth there. They are chasing the little status bump of being the person who doesn't just believe everything, which is a great way to be annoying and still feel principled.
That is the trap. They confuse skepticism with being owed an interrogation, and those are not the same thing. Skepticism says, let me make sure I understand. Interrogation says, convince me you are allowed to have this boundary.
And that is where curiosity turns into gossip. Once the question stops helping with safety, it starts serving the room. People want a story, or they want to see who blinks first, or they want to see whether the person folds and makes it easy for everybody else.
Or they want the person to back down so the rest of the table does not have to change anything. That is why tone matters as much as content. What do you need from us? And so what's the real story? May sound close, but one is trying to help and the other is trying to corner somebody.
Yeah, and the fairer version is usually shorter than people want. If you are asking because you need to cook safely, ask the practical question and stop. If you are asking because you are suspicious, admit that you are suspicious instead of pretending you are just being responsible.
That is the part people dodge. There is nothing noble about pretending your nosiness is public service. If you really want to know whether the dish is safe, ask about the dish. If you want to judge the person, at least be honest that you are judging them.
So the line is simple. Safety questions, logistics questions, fine. Proof demanding, status playing, story hunting questions, no. And the frustrating part is that ordinary diners and hosts keep rewarding the nosy version like it was the responsible one.
Yeah, and that is the uncomfortable follow-up. If people keep getting away with that little performance, then the whole table learns the wrong lesson.
Which is why the next ugly question is obvious. Are we the ones teaching people to do this? Okay, but here's the ugly little question we keep dodging. Sometimes the weirdness doesn't start with the person saying, I have a food allergy. Sometimes it starts with everybody else assuming they need to either perform proof or perform trust. That's the part that makes the whole dinner table thing so stupid.
That's the useful angle. Because if we only blame the host or only blame the guest, we miss the loop. One side expects skepticism, the other side expects coddling, and both sides start acting like they're defending themselves before anything bad has even happened.
Right, and the guest learns pretty fast that if they're too casual, somebody will go, wait, are you actually allergic or just picky? So they over-explain. They start narrating their whole medical autobiography over pasta, like they're trying to get parole.
And the host learns the opposite lesson. If they don't ask enough questions, they might be the careless one. So they ask one question, then another, then suddenly it feels less like dinner and more like a tiny compliance interview.
So they start interrogating the salad like it's a witness.
Pretty much. And once that happens, the guest hears suspicion even if the host thinks they're being careful, which means the guest comes in even more armored next time. That's how a simple request turns into a whole defensive posture.
So let me push you on this because I can hear the annoying, responsible adult voice already. Are you saying people should just believe everybody immediately? Or is there a sane middle ground that doesn't make every meal feel like evidence collection?
Sane middle ground is take the request seriously. Don't make a big scene and ask only what you actually need to know to avoid messing it up. You do not need a courtroom standard before you stop putting nuts in someone's food.
That's the part people miss. Everybody wants to be the reasonable one, but they still want the other person to do the extra work. They want to look relaxed while quietly making the whole interaction more annoying.
Yes, and the social reward for that is pretty strong. If you're the host, you get to feel generous without changing much. If you're the guest, you get to feel principled without having to be brief. Everybody gets a little moral glow, and the conversation gets worse.
And once people get used to that glow, they start training each other into the same performance. The host expects the guest to come in ready for doubt. The guest expects the host to act like a skeptical gatekeeper. Nobody says that out loud, but everybody feels it in the first 30 seconds.
That's exactly why the whole thing gets sticky. The reaction becomes part of the script. A guest who has been grilled before arrives over-prepared, which makes them sound dramatic, which makes the host think, see, this is a lot. Then the host gets more careful in the worst possible way. by getting more suspicious.
So the weirdest part is that both people think they're protecting themselves from being unfair. The guest is protecting themselves from being dismissed. The host is protecting themselves from being blamed. And the result is everybody acting like the meal is going to court.
Exactly. And the annoying thing is that there is a real version of caution in there. It is not crazy to want to avoid a mistake. It is crazy when caution turns into a little ritual where the host gets to look mature by making the other person prove a basic need again and again.
That ritual is the whole scam, honestly. It lets people keep the self-image of being kind, sane, and practical while still making the other person jump through hoops. It's basically politeness with a hidden obstacle course.
I mean, that's the better version of your complaint. Not that everyone is malicious, just that the script rewards the wrong thing. The person who asks the fewest useful questions and the most status questions often feels like the most responsible person in the room.
So the practical fix is almost offensively boring. Stop auditioning for the role of good host. Stop auditioning for the role of aggrieved guest. And just make the adjustment without turning it into a whole identity speech. That sound right? Or am I sanding off too much of the tension?
That's basically it. Keep the question short, keep the answer simple, and don't make the other person earn basic accommodation with a monologue. If we want the whole thing to be less weird, everyone has to stop treating a meal like a moral trial and start treating it like dinner again.
Okay, so the clean ending is this. If somebody says they have a food allergy, the default move is not, let me see your paperwork. The default move is to treat it like a real boundary first. You can still ask limited questions when you need to plan the meal safely, but the baseline is respect, not suspicion theater. That's the part people want to skip because suspicion feels more intellectual than plain courtesy.
That's the part worth keeping. The suspicion isn't invented. People do mix up allergies, preferences, and personal rules all the time. But once you make doubt your first reflex, you turn a normal shared meal into a little audit. And nobody asked for that. They asked for dinner, not a committee hearing over the pasta.
And the reason people get so prickly is that they hear the allergy claim as an accusation. Not always consciously, but it lands like, you might have poisoned me, or your food is sloppy, or you are now on trial as a host. That's a lot of emotional baggage for what is, on the surface, just somebody trying to avoid a bad reaction.
Right, and that's why the social response can get so weird. The meal is a friendly space, so any boundary can feel personal even when it isn't meant that way. But that feeling doesn't make the boundary illegitimate. It just means people are bringing ego to a problem that mostly needs labels and common sense.
So Joe, where would you draw the line? Because I think that's the real question now. If you're hosting, what's the fair amount of asking before it turns into you being that guy who needs every sandwich documented like it's evidence? I don't mean zero questions. I mean, what counts as a sane check versus a little credibility test?
I'd keep it brutally practical. Ask what matters for the meal. What ingredient? How serious? Whether cross-contact is a problem. Whether there's a safer substitute. And stop there, unless there's some reason the answer changes what you serve. If the question is about safety or planning, fine. If the question is really, prove it to my satisfaction, that's not care anymore. That's you wanting to feel settled at somebody else's expense.
That's the useful distinction, because people love to hide behind the word clarify when what they actually mean is, I don't believe you yet. And sometimes the suspicion is understandable, sure, But you do have to notice when your private doubt is now making somebody perform their body like it is a little courtroom drama. That is way too much theater for whether the salad has sesame oil in it.
And if we're being fair, the suspicious version is strongest when there's a pattern of people using food labels loosely in that group or context. But even then, the right response is not to turn every claim into a challenge by default. It's to quietly tighten the question to what you need, not to what feeds your curiosity. Curiosity is fine when you're researching a story. It's less charming when you're standing over a bowl of soup.
Okay, but what about the person who has a long list or who seems to change the rules every time? That's where people start feeling like the whole conversation has become slippery. Are we still supposed to just nod and move on? Or is there a point where the host can say, I want to accommodate you, but I need this in a form I can actually use?
That's fair. If the person is hard to accommodate, the answer is not to stage a public proof contest. The answer is to say, tell me what I need to know so I don't screw this up. And if you still can't make it work, be honest about that. You can decline to host a meal you can't safely handle without accusing somebody of fraud like you're on a bad detective show.
Yeah, and that part matters because not every mismatch is a moral crisis. Sometimes the honest outcome is just, I can't safely cook for you, so let's do something simpler. That is way cleaner than pretending to cooperate while secretly auditioning for the role of food skeptic number one. If you can't handle the restriction, say that plainly and stop trying to convert it into a personality problem.
Exactly. The best version of this whole argument is not trust everybody blindly, and it's not demand evidence for every bite. It's treat the claim as real enough to act on, ask only what changes the food, and if your doubt is bigger than that, handle your doubt privately instead of making it the guest's problem. Shared meals already have enough ways to go wrong without adding a weird little interrogation aesthetic.
So the final rule is almost boring, which is usually a good sign. Believe the boundary enough to accommodate it. Ask only the minimum needed for safety and logistics. Don't make someone defend their restriction like they're trying to win a scholarship in front of the appetizers. And if you don't trust the person, deal with that feeling without making it the whole table's problem.
That's the balance I'd keep too. Trust first, verify only where the verification changes the food. And don't confuse a normal planning question with a moral cross-examination. Most people don't need you to solve the truth of every ingredient. They need you to not be weird for 10 seconds and hand them something they can safely eat.
Which is annoyingly adult because the answer is not believe everyone blindly, and it's not interrogate the spinach until it confesses. It's just take the boundary seriously, keep your questions limited, and don't act personally wounded because somebody asked you to swap the sauce. That's the whole trick. And somehow people still behave like they were handed a personal insult instead of dinner instructions.
So, that's the end of this one. Thanks for joining us on Say the Question. Subscribe or follow, and we'll be back tomorrow.